Today, we're going to be making a concept map around solving quadratic equations. So a concept map is a visual diagram about how we link all of the concepts that we've learned together with this particular one around solving quadratic equations. So the first concept that we're going to link to it is what we've been working on in this unit, which is graphing. So in particular, what we're looking for when we're solving quadratic equations is generally we've been using this to find the x-intercepts, which we also called roots or zeros. Now, mainly if you're writing down a graph, probably the easiest way to graph something is using vertex form. So if we have vertex form, that would be ideal for drawing the graph. And the domain and the range of the graph can also give us hints as to what the solutions might be. Where domain is a set of x values that are allowed and the range is a set of y values. And all of this links back to the concept of solving systems of equations. Using the graphical method. So the main example that we're going to see here is if we have a graph and we've got some parabola living somewhere, and we've got another line, we're going to be looking for the intersection points of the parabola and the line. The easiest example is where the line's a constant, like in the red graph here, but it could easily be a different line or even another parabola. And once again, you would just be looking for the two intersection points with graphing. The second technique that we will see to solve quadratic equations involves another concept that we've seen called factoring. Now, the big thing about factoring and solving quadratic equations is if we have something in factored form, it's actually really easy to solve using the zero property of equality. So we're going to try to factor things to get factored form so we can use this zero property of equality. And the zero property of equality says that if you have two numbers times each other, so a times b, and you get 0, then either a equals 0 or b equals 0. The way that we're going to see that with our graphs is we're going to get something factored like x minus 3 times x plus 1 equals 0, and then we would hope to be able to solve that. In order to do that, we're going to split it apart. So we'll get x minus 3 equals 0, or x minus 3, or x plus 1. Equals 0. And then you can solve these just like linear equations. So you would add 3 to both sides, and you get x equals 3. Or you would subtract 1 from both sides and you get x equals minus 1. So that's how we're going to be using the zero property of equality to solve our quadratic equations. So how this is going to play in is if we actually have standard form. Then what we're going to try to do is use our box and our cross to be able to factor it to get factored form. And then we can use the zero property of equality. Once we have something like x minus 3 times x plus 1 equals 0, we can use the zero property of equality to solve. But the big idea is we want this standard form to get to factored form. Oh. Things are running away on me. All right. So if we zoom out, we can see what our diagram looks like. So factoring is going to be the second thing that we're going to do. The third technique we're going to see to solve quadratic equations involves completing the square. So we have seen this briefly when we did our foldable on all the different forms of quadratics. So what we saw was there was something involving the box. Somehow you need to complete it, so we're looking for this number that we're going to have to add into the box to actually make it a square. Some other things that we're going to need are we're going to need to know or remember things about radicals, and in particular square root. As that will be how we will use completing the square to actually solve things. The big thing about completing the square is it gives us vertex form. From standard form. And then if we remember our standard or our equations, vertex form had this negative b over 2a thing, which will also be important when we're completing the square purely with algebra and not using the box. One last thing is when you take the square root of things, when you're solving equations, you get this plus or minus coming out. So that's a new symbol that we will have to deal with. So this is the third way that we will solve quadratic equations. And then the last way that we're going to solve quadratic equations involves something called the quadratic formula. The nice thing about the quadratic formula is that it is universal, it always works, which makes it very simple to use. The things that we're going to have to know about are we're going to have to know some more about square roots. The formula does have this plus or minus symbol in it again, so similar to completing the square. And this is primarily used with standard form. So you're going to need to know A, B, and C. And it's going to be a formula that we want to memorize. One other quick thing that we're going to need to know with the quadratic formula is there is another kind of new vocabulary term. There's this thing called the discriminant. Which is b squared minus 4ac. And you're going to need to know both how to identify that and what it means. This is the last way that we will see how to solve quadratic equations for this year. So if we zoom out, we can see our completed concept map. Enjoy.